I do not know if I deserve it, but I've stopped asking that question long back. In fact, this is the Isaac Sequeira Memorial Lecture, and I get a feeling that another memorial lecture for me has already been delivered. It's a wonderful, wonderful sentiment for all teachers to find that what they did had not gone in vain, that it is to some extent remembered, and that it has perhaps some kind of a residual use even now. Before that, um, uh, Manju had already warned you that you should not expect much from the kind of discourse that I have to offer. And even before that, if I had delivered such a splendid keynote address of top-class scholarship, that, as people say, people who have spoken before have made my task easier. Ifat has almost made my task redundant. But we'll come to that. We'll come to that in a moment. First, Isaac. Isaac Sequeira, I've been thinking of him. I met him 3 or 4 times, not more often. He lived in Hyderabad, I lived in Delhi. I went to Hyderabad a few times. He came to Delhi once or twice. So we've met. But I also spoke to a number of people who knew him far better because they were in Hyderabad. And one thing about Isaac is that nobody mentions his name, nobody remembers him without some warmth suffusing their memories and their hearts. What a wonderful person he was. And I regret that I did not know him better. At the same time, I feel extremely fortunate that I knew him to the extent I did. He was one of the pioneers of the study of popular culture in India. Those were the days when popular culture came to us from abroad. Their popular culture was our popular culture. American popular culture was the only culture, popular culture, that we dared to study. And when the British popular culture was introduced, it was Agatha Christie, which was as unpopular and unforeign to us students as Shakespeare. The contradictions of the popular are many, but one of the earliest pioneers to negotiate the complexity of the popular in this way was Isaac. His fame rests on the fact that he was equally conversant with American popular culture and Indian popular culture, and he displayed that in everything he said and wrote and lectured on. In fact, what he's most warmly remembered for is that even in his classroom lectures, when talking about popular culture of America, he would bring in the influence of American popular culture, mainly through Hollywood, on Bollywood, particularly in terms of songs. And one special gift that he had was he sang very well. So he would first sing a Hollywood film song, and then he would sing a Bollywood film song which had been stolen from that tune. And he would also swing his body suitably to those songs. And sometimes when he didn't feel like singing, he would just whistle. Have you known any professor of English or even Hindi or Kannada or whatever who can whistle in class? Try it and you may be thrown out. But Isaac carried it off so beautifully and naturally. I don't know why I'm telling you all this, because this may raise false expectations in your minds. Only Isaac could do it. Nobody else can do it. So don't expect much. He, apart from popular culture of America, he also had a great passion for the local popular culture, independent of Western popular culture. He went to Mushairas in Hyderabad. He went to Qawwalis. He could sing both those also equally well. Singing is a universal gift in these matters. And there was another aspect to him. I mean, Manju has done sterling work in running Mellors and then Melow through these years, the 26th conference. What a wonderful achievement. And we can see how much she personally and singly has to do. Everybody sees that each time a conference is held. She has a team, but the team, there's no doubting at all as to who leads the team and who inspires the team. I've also done a few associations in my time for more than 20 odd years, and I know what is involved, holding these conferences year after year. The multi-ethnic literature of the United States is how it began. It has grown Melow, that conception, and now it has become the multi-ethnic literatures of the world. What is multi-ethnic? In the expanded agenda of Melow that was read out today, I think by the Vice Chancellor, from a part of a script provided by Manju, as he said. Oh, provided by, yeah, right, okay. Yeah, and Preet. This was, the agenda expansion is multi-ethnic, it's not multi-ethnic until it is multicultural. And it's not truly multicultural until it is multilingual. I say this because Isaac was a wonderful example of this. Isaac's ancestors were Saraswat Brahmins from the Konkan region. So he was a Konkanist Brahmin by heredity. Then he became, living in Goa, he became a Roman Catholic. And then his forefathers, maybe his grandfather or father, moved from Goa to Hyderabad. And he picked up Hyderabadi culture as if he was born to it. If a single person can be multi-ethnic in this broad, wide-ranging sense, Isaac Sequeira was that person. No wonder he was associated with this association since before his birth, actually, in all kinds of vital ways. I'll read out a poem written to Isaac Sequeira by his dear friend Mohan Ramanan, who lived in Hyderabad and was a colleague of Isaac. There are not many people who have poems written to them, unless both the writer and the object of the poem are adolescents, and they write what they think are poems. But this is the real poem by Mohan Ramanan, himself professor of English at Hyderabad. I knew you, Isaac, through the confessional. No, not the chaplain's privileged box, but with the articulated angst of Sylvia and Robert and John. These are the first names of American poets who wrote confessional poetry, as you would recognize. And I long to hijack you, Isaac. That's what comes when you begin writing poetry. You think of rhymes, you think of internal rhymes, you think of external rhymes. And I long to hijack you, Isaac, to have you all to myself alone, but you are the king of the carnivalist. It's a nice phrase for him, king of the carnivalist. You are the people who demand your attention. You become them. Thank you, Isaac, for your Johnsonian clubbish love. Every evening he was found at the Nizam's club. For he was clubbish even literally. He was extremely gregarious and open-hearted, generous. A presence which was a fullness of being. Can we ever forget the ringing baritone of your voice? Your cheery laughter, your affectionate wink and nudge, your wit and your witnessing of wit, you will always remain our own, our Bhishma, our Pitamaha, the only begetter, only of course O-N-L-I-E, as in Shakespeare, the only begetter of all of us in love with America and the idea of America. You can see that this poem was written several decades ago. Being in love with America and the idea of America was a historical phase in our national life, in our intellect, and that phase has well and truly passed. But it represents a certain phase in the development of English studies as well. And Isaac is as good an example of that as anyone who could be found. You may think that that was my lecture. I've taken some time over it. But what I will do is now, I hope that not many of you are so punctilious and so conscientious as to have read the book of abstracts. Maybe you will do it when you get back home or not even then. So what I will do is I will read out my abstract and then I'll fill it out. It's in 3 parts. In this lecture, I seek to propound 2 related arguments. The first is that adaptation is not the younger, libertine, footloose, and less reputable sister of the more faithful, decorous, and virtuous translation, as is often assumed to be the case. Rather, in terms of lineage and chronology, adaptation is the mother of the far too prim and proper and sterile translation. A question to ask here may be, when is a good translation not an adaptation? Indeed, adaptation is far the older practice universally in all literary cultures, and for that matter, in all aspects of life generally. I will broaden this argument in a little later. The second proposition of mine arises from a broad survey of the evolution of literary cultures across the world from antiquity to our own day. There's a kind of a demonstration of the idea of adaptation through examples, not only process from Homer, Valmiki, Kalidas, Dandel, Tulsidas, Shakespeare, Dr. Johnson, Byron, Gitanjali Sri, and Banu Mushtaq. That's called showing off. And I will proceed to do that. It will be seen that classicism, imitation, quote unquote, or what in the Indian literary tradition is called Riti, the Bhakti period and the Riti period. Riti is classicism. All these, and they all, and of course, retelling and adaptation, which also belong to that same stable, have traditionally been accorded higher value in most literary cultures than originality. If I had a few acute things to say about the notion of originality in terms of modern theoretical discourse, let me take you back a little bit in literary history. Before the Romantic poets came along, no poet wanted to claim to be original in English. Dr. Johnson, who was the great literary patriarch, the dictator of taste in the 18th century, he openly, not confessed, claimed with pride that some of the poems that he wrote, like The Vanity of Human Wishes, was actually modeled closely on a Latin poem. And this was a mark of virtuosity. This was a mark of creation. In fact, originality began with the Romantic poets in English, and therefore originality remains an impossible Romantic concept. Anyone who claims to be original must be a Romantic, and therefore not in touch with reality. There's one hallmark of the Romantics. Let me cite some examples and then I'll come back to a paragraph that I have by way of conclusion. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana are the oldest texts, oldest literary texts, non-Vedic texts, not the Vedas and the Upanishads. Even the Vedas, in all great cultures, in all ancient cultures, there's something called the creation hymn. How did the world originate? The origin of the world, and that's also a claim to be original in one sense. The best that I've read about 10 creation hymns because I've been into world literature and I've liked comparing these earliest speculations or claims of knowledge about how the world began. In the Rig Veda, there is the Nasadiya Sutta. And if you have not read it, do yourself a favor. It's available in many English translations. Nasadiya is from the word nasad. Na asad nahi tha. Was not. That's the title of the sutta, and what does it say? What was there in the beginning? Was there the dark? Was there light? Was there water? Was there land? We do not know. And who created it? How did it come into being? The gods did not, because even the gods were created. The gods came later. They would not know. And thus it goes on. And finally it concludes, maybe, possibly, there is someone up above. It doesn't say heaven. Up above, somewhere. Maybe there is someone or something up above who or which knows how it began, or maybe even it does not. That is the finest speculation. There can be no definite knowledge. That's the finest speculation that I have ever read about the origin of the universe. And this applies not only to poets, but also to scientists. The very idea of origin, a definite origin, which can be dated to a particular point and to a particular mode of creation, is an impossibility, according to the Rig Veda. If we are going to have an Indian knowledge system, let's begin with that. Let's begin with the height of imagination and speculation, a sublime speculation about how there can be no knowledge of how knowledge began. About the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, Valmiki is called the Adi Kavi, the original poet, the first poet. But did it begin with Valmiki? No. People know the first shloka, Manishad Pratishtama Tomagama Shashwati Samaha. No. After that, Valmiki says, having uttered that shlok, Valmiki says, what have I done? Have I spoken a shlok? Has poetry come out of my mouth unwittingly? Shokat shlokam upagata. From shoka, grief at the killing of this bird, have I proceeded to shloka without even knowing it? Shokat shlokam upagata. But then, as we proceed, as we turn a couple of pages, we find out in the Valmiki Ramayana that Narad has come to Valmiki and in brief, in a capsule, in abstract, recited the whole Rama story. So Valmiki is not the first poet. He's not the original poet. And Lava and Kush, who will know the story and who will recite it. Valmiki will not recite it. Love and Kush will recite it. So there's a metatextuality built into the first text, first literary text. And metatextuality always denies origins, the certainty of origins. Mahabharata is written by Vyas. What does Vyas mean? What kind of a name is Vyas? Vyas means compiler. In Sanskrit, Vyas means somebody who puts things together. That obviously means he's not the author. There are many sources of its origin. In the beginning, it was only 20,000 words. It was Bharat, Jaya. These were the titles. It became Mahabharata through many additions and accretions over the centuries. The very idea of an original text or single text is negated by the growth of the Mahabharata. Who are the main retailers? Not retailers. Who are the main creators of further Ramayanas? After Valmiki, which is the language in which the Ramayana appears as an independent epic? The Bengalis think is Krittibash, Hindi walas think is Tulsidas, but actually is Kambana in Tamil. That's the chronology. And what does Kamba say at the beginning of his epic? He says, Valmiki is like milk, and I'm like a cat, and I'm just lapping up Valmiki. And at the same time, the Kamba Ramayana is very distinct in tone, and sometimes even in episodes, in characterization, than Valmiki. You say that in the beginning to indicate the depth of your debt, but then you are free to proceed as you like and to show your creativity in ways that suit you and your culture, your linguistic culture. A slightly more complex statement is made at the beginning by how the Hindi Ramayana begins, Hindi Ramcharitmanas. That's the first thing. The Hindi Ramayana, what we call the Hindi Ramayana, is not called Ramayana by Tulsidas. Tulsidas called it Ramcharitmanas. The Kamba Ramayana was called Ramavataram, but it's called the Tamil Ramayana or the Kamba Ramayana. Even the title comes down, though the book is different. That's the interplay of the so-called original text and adaptations. Tulsidas has a very complex statement of his relationship to the Valmiki Ramayana. I already told you about my instinct, my proclivity to show off, and this is one golden moment. So what does Tulsidas say about what he's doing in his epic? Nana Purana Nigumagam Sammatamyar Ramayane Nigatitam Kvachidanyatopi Swanta Sukhaya Tulsi Raghunath Gatha Bhasha Nibandhamati Manjula Matanoti. What is narrated in the many Puranas, in Nigam, in Agam, which are two kinds of scriptures, and in Ramayana. Ramayana can mean many Ramayans. Tulsidas relied not only on the Valmiki Ramayana, but equally on the Adhyatma Ramayana. That was also called Ramayana. Ramayane Nigaditam Kvachidanya Topi. It's a lovely statement. All these are my sources. Purana, Agam, Nigam, Ramayana, many Ramayanas. Kvachidanya Topi, and a little bit from somewhere else. What is that little bit from somewhere else? It comes from here. It comes from Tulsi's head. It comes from his creativity. And very modestly, he says, some of it from somewhere else. Kvachidanya. And then he says, Swanta Sukhaya Tulsi Raghunath Gatha. Why has Tulsi created this epic? Swanta Sukhaya. For my own happiness, for my own joy. Which is again modesty, deep modesty, because in the next line he does say, I want to bring it out of Sanskrit into Bhasha, what people actually speak. And the adaptation, so-called, I don't call it adaptation, all these major Ramayanas in our own modern Indian languages are fully creative and fully independent, even though the plot may be very similar. We don't go by plot alone. Plot, as Ifat was pointing out, as we all know, Shakespeare never invented a single plot. Shakespeare is the ultimate proof that plots matter, but not very much. is your treatment, is your characterization, and is the excess beyond characterization, beyond the fulfillment of the plot, a fine excess which Keats defined as true poetry. That's what true poet does. In Sanskrit, Dandi and other theoreticians of Sanskrit literature make a distinction between two kinds of stories, two kinds of narratives. One is katha and the other is akhyayika. One is a story that you have invented yourself, the author, and the other is a story that has already been narrated before. And which is better? Which is higher? In Sanskrit, there is no clear preference. If you take a story that has already been narrated and that your audience is familiar with, then the challenge of creativity before you is even greater. Then how do you make it interesting? How do you make it new? So these are the categories already known to Sanskrit poeticians, Sanskrit aesthetists. And I think there's a lot, in fact, there's a lot to be said for the challenge of recreating what is already there, what is already familiar, making the familiar new. I had a couple more examples in mind. Lord Byron, romantic and classicist in one. If I had to name just one writer who was as great a romantic as he was a classicist, it would be Lord Byron in English. In Don Juan, long epic, he wrote, "My poem's epic." Now, it's a mock epic, but he is claiming it to be epic, and that's why it's a mock epic. My poem's epic, and is meant to be divided in 12 books. He's mocking the idea of the epic while adopting it, and of course, his poem goes on beyond 12 books. Why 12 books? Homer had 24 books in each of his two epics. Later poets, including Virgil, thought they cannot be half as great, so they wrote only 12 books. And then all the poets afterwards wrote only 12 books. So Byron says, my poem's epic and is meant to be divided in 12 books, each book containing, with love and war, a heavy gale at sea, a list of ships and captains and kings reigning. He is making fun of the fact that an epic can be reduced to a formula. These are the themes, this is the plot, that's how it progresses. That is the interplay between what comes down as tradition and what each original poet, each new poet expresses as individual talent. I'll come now to Gitanjali Shri, her Booker-winning novel, the book of a translation-winning novel, Ret Samadhi, has been translated by Daisy Rockwell. I've known Daisy for as long as I've known Gitanjali. I met Daisy in Chicago in 1998 when she just finished a PhD on Upendranath Ashk. I'm not criticizing her, but I'm just citing her. Ret Samadhi and Tomb of Sand, are they even remotely similar? What is Samadhi? उन्होंने जल समाधि ले ली, उन्होंने रेत समाधि ले ली, या even without an adjective, उन्होंने समाधि ले ली. What does tomb mean? But I'll address one word of caution regarding translation. Having taught translation studies for a long time in the MPhil classes in Delhi, and having supervised some work as translation, I would caution everyone who laughs at translations not to do so, but to earn the right to do so by suggesting something better. So if Tomb of Sand is not a good translation, let us hear what a good translation or a more satisfactory translation of Ret Samadhi will be. Don't tell me now. Think about it till the end of my lecture or till the break comes and tell me then. Let's have a pool of alternative titles. Similarly, Banu Mushtaq, heart lamb. Heart lamb sounds nothing if not awkward in English. It's not a table lamb. That's the kind of compound that go with the word lamb. Heart lamb. In Kannada, Hridaya Deepa. Sounds good. It'll sound good in Hindi as well. But that kind of compound does not transfer automatically to English. Then there is a sentence in that novel, in the translation, which is, her heart fell. Her heart fell. In English, we say her face fell. So this is perhaps being deliberately, perhaps unwittingly, being extended by the translator. Does it work? And another question to ask is, does it work for Indians as well as it works for the Booker jury? We apply different standards. They're looking for something new and unsettling. We are not looking for anything new and unsettling. We are sometimes unsettled by what we find. So receptivity, again, if I was talking about that, what is the original? If a reader, if all kinds of readers, any number of readers read it differently. I wouldn't go that far, but yes, a community of readers, of a certain well-defined community of readers, how will they read? I'll go back now to finish by raising some larger factors. The present overvaluation of originality, uniqueness, and faithful translation. Ifrit and others too in translation studies have talked about fidelity. Where does that come from? It's one of the most sexist words in the English language. Women are supposed to have fidelity. Men are exempt from it, of course. And fidelity is largely sexual fidelity. That's where the word begins. Faithfulness is the faithful wife. So let us at least get rid of these horrible connotations of words that we have imported into translation studies. The overvaluation of originality derives not only from this self-serving misconception, but also from another factor. And that is the capitalist legislative systems of private ownership. If you claim a book to be original, then nobody can print it except you. The copyright law will stop the others. You own it as private property. This was not always an idea of literature. Literature was sahitya. Sahitya se bhava hai, sahitya hai. Not only for the good of everyone, sahitya se bhava, but being together. Sahitya has also the sense of being together. Kabir, nobody knows how many verses he wrote. Because anybody who came along in later centuries and admired Kabir added about 10 to 20 of his own. And in the last line wrote Kahat Kabir. Similarly with Surdas, anybody who wrote padas, if you write an epic, you're okay. Because anybody who adds to it can clearly be found out. But if you write padas, 8-line, 10-line verses, anybody can add. That was the idea. It wasn't a bad thing either. It wasn't faking. It wasn't fraud. It was a collective endeavor. The copyright law has prioritized something called originality in a way that nothing before it had. And it's not very old. The copyright law was codified in the 1870s and 1880s with the rise of modern capitalism. I myself have a copyright issue with my own publishers. I cannot reprint it, even part of it, without their permission. Copyright, if it belonged to the author, that would be one thing. It belongs to the capitalist publisher. Anyhow, Uh, I would extend this just a little bit to introduce two other concepts. And one of this is that even in biological terms, even in terms of physical evolution, it is adaptability that has made some species survive and some species perish. Adaptability to the evolving circumstances has then resulted in the evolution of those species. It's not survival of the fittest. I'm not very fit and I'm surviving, and many other people have been not fit. It's not fit in the sense of physical strength or how trim you are. It is how adaptable you are, how resourceful you are in adapting to the new circumstances, which is mental fitness and therefore adaptability. That word survival of the fittest has been quite misleading in this context. So, from a capitalist point of view, from a biological evolutionary point of view, and finally, in Sanskrit, there is a very curious phenomenon, which is reverse originality. This puts the candle under the notion of originality. What is reverse originality? You have some very, very interesting ideas, philosophical ideas about the world, but you don't write your own book. You don't propagate them under your own name. If you are a real genius, if you are the biggest Sanskrit intellectual of all times, then you write a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. You write a commentary on the Upanishads, and in the form of that commentary, you express all the originality, all the new ideas that you have ever had. Who did that? Adi Shankaracharya. Adi Shankaracharya was the most effective, the most influential thinker. The Gita did not remain the Gita it was before Adi Shankaracharya. It's his commentary that makes it the modern Gita. All further commentaries are based on him. Similarly, the Upanishads. If you haven't read Adi Shankaracharya, it's useless you're reading Upanishads without his commentary. Abhinav Gupta, the greatest theoretician of Indian aesthetics after Bharat Muni, what did he write? He wrote a commentary on the Natya Shastra. He wrote a commentary on that, and the commentary had so many original points. But as I said, reverse originality. Pretending that you are not original, you're just commenting, you're adding to the accumulative process. Abhinav Bharati by Abhinav Gupta in the 10th century Kashmir is as great a work in many ways as the Natya Shastra by Bharat, on which it is based. Bharati is a book about Bharat, Abhinav Bharati. Finally, how many times have I said finally? But this is finally. It strikes me, and it struck me after I came to Dharamshala. The Vice Chancellor was saying it's a very peaceful place that will help you contemplate. It hasn't happened in any other way to me. But this idea came to me this morning, so I will perhaps give Dharamshala the credit for it. The original adaptation takes place whenever we say anything. That's a paradox, the original adaptation. The first adaptation takes place when we say anything at all. We think of saying something and then we say it. But necessarily the articulation, the performative act of speech adapts what we had thought of saying. And sometimes the gap is so obvious, even we are surprised, or perhaps not surprised. I'll end with another quotation which exemplifies this. Faiz Sahab का शेर है, घर से तो हर मुआमला करके चले थे साफ हम. Every matter we had settled in the privacy I had settled of my own mind that as to what I will say. घर से तो हर मुआमला करके चले थे साफ हम, कहने में उनके सामने बात बदल बदल गई। कहने में उनके सामने बात बदल 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 नहीं गई, बदल बदल गई। This is the original adaptation. इतनी मैंने संस्कृत बोली ताली नहीं बजी, उर्दू में बजती है। तभी तो आइजैक सिक्वेरा कव्वाली में और मुशायरे में जाते थे। थैंक यू ऑल वेरी मच।
Well, ladies and gentlemen, now I am standing here with elements of trepidation and fear. We always wonder, how can Professor Trivedi always do this? But you mesmerize all of us throughout our lives, and you still keep on mesmerizing us. Ladies and gentlemen, what can be a better adaptation than Professor Trivedi's recitation of Professor Mohan Ramana's poem on Professor Isaac Secular? Sir, the way you recited the poem, it brought tears to my eyes. I am here to just to say a few things about, not to condense the lecture, obviously, such a vast terrain of lecture, such a vast terrain he covered. A whole plethora of thinkers, writers, practitioners, everything. It can't be condensed at all by a few words. Yet, I will attempt to say a few things. Professor Trivedi started his lecture, of course, with by giving his homage to Professor Isaac Sequeira. And he brought this very interesting and a very complicated connection between adaptation and a translation, which I was looking for. And he went into the lineages, chronology of the translation. And he even made the point that much before translation came into existence, perhaps, there was this idea of adaptation, which acted as a mother to translation, of translation. His second interesting trajectory was the evolution of various literary cultures of in India, where he made a very trenchant and a very powerful critique of the concept of originality, to which most of us academics try to stick on to even in our problematic times. However, this question of originality, it raises a whole range of other issues. Particularly in the context of the 20th century, when fascism was reaching its heights, it was Walter Benjamin who really critiqued and attacked the pedestal of originality. But much before Benjamin, we never can forget about another powerful figure, Mikhail Bakhtin. And when Professor Trivedi recited this poem, one word which struck me was Professor Mohan Ramanan writes about Professor Isaac Secular, you are the king of the carnivalesque. And carnivalesque is the theory of Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin was asked once, what is your notion of language? And Bakhtin explained it very fascinatingly. For instance, there is nothing like a pure and original language. If there was a pure and original language, there would be only one person who might have spoken that. That was Adam. And ever since the progeny of Adam came into existence, the purity of the language got completely lost and language got tainted. In his amazing trajectory of tracing the antiquity from the Greek and the Roman times, Professor Trivedi also made this interesting and a very, very powerful point that every retelling is a kind of an adaptation, which I completely agree with. He also spoke about Nazdesh Ved, which means Na, Azad, Nahi, Daha. Okay, which even I have to do some kind of work on this. Though I knew about it some time back, I did not give enough concentration to that. And he made this excellent idea, the excellent remark regarding many Ramayanas. And let me tell you that both of us are hailing from a university. where a very powerful article called Many Ramayanas, written by one of the greatest philologists in the world, Professor A.K. Ramanujan, was taken out of the syllabus. Perhaps some of you would know this, people who are out of Delhi University. We made a lot of hue and cry to bring back that essay, but it did not work out. Next to that, Professor Trivedi was giving us the idea that the flimsiness of the plots. That brought me to one of the very powerful adaptations, the film, The Throne of Blood by Akira Kurosawa. Macbeth, Shakespeare's Macbeth. And Kurosawa, while he was shooting this movie, was asked a few questions. Why can't you give that kind of concentration to the exact lines, the exact way Macbeth comes and the witches appear? Kurosawa completely denied that, and he said, never, I'm not going to do that. And there are 5 takes in Kurosawa's movie where Kurosawa's king, he is on top of the horse. He is about to ride the horse, but the fog descends. And the horse is trying, is making an attempt to cross the fog. And there are 5 different takes, which makes us clear about the internal contradictions, incriminations in the mind of a ruler to do. And that exactly is to be or not to be. But however, for Macbeth and also for Kurosawa, there are lines for that. Similarly, it also brings this idea of intersectionality and intertextuality. Intersectionality was not properly dealt in the previous lectures, but intertextuality was brilliantly dealt. And the idea of the metatext. And I am particularly glad when Professor Trivedi talked about Kambi Ramayana, because Kambi Ramayana, if you go out of India, if you get a chance to do a course in Southern California, University of Southern California, or in Chicago, and also in Indiana University, I have heard enough lectures on Kambi Ramayana, complicating the notion of the adaptation, and also what exactly was Kamba's own physiological as well as demographic notion about writing a Ramayana. That is a very, very important thing. This also brings to my mind one of the ideas which I recently happened to get across. As you would be knowing, the powerful text by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, The General in His Labyrinth. And in the El General en su Laberinto, that's a Spanish title, the general, Simon Bolivar, takes a journey, and while he was traveling, he had to pass through an alley. And on both sides of the alley, there were a lot of slave women doing little bit of works. Enraptured by the beauty of a slave woman, the general just pulls up a slave woman and gives her a kiss. And the slave woman says, General, I am a slave. And the reply of the general is, from now onwards, you are not a slave. Now the question is, what kind of an adaptation can you make out of this in this extremely complicated, post-colonial, post-modern, digital, artificial intelligence kind of a world? Because the point is, what general makes is not the question of just a temporality and history. On the contrary, the general was crisscrossing, breaking the boundaries, breaking the threshold of slavery, and that entire region of Venezuela had never seen slavery after that. A kiss, perhaps, can make you better adapted. And in the last part of his lecture, Professor Trivedi went into a number of things. And the most interesting thing for me was his notion of adaptability. And I'm particularly glad, sir, that you dismantled the word which is commonly associated with translation and also adaptability, which is called fidelity. And we have been raising this issue ever since we have been going through several theories of translation by Lawrence Venuti and many, many others. I can give you the names of many people, but I don't want to do that. But that actually is a very, very flimsy, very, very innocuous, and a very, very confusing word, which most of the translation critics have been making use of since time immemorial, I would say. And Professor Trivedi, this idea of adaptability is primarily centered on the ways in which, the methodologies in which, or the kind of the social milieu in which we can adapt to a particular situation. And the question of the titles, which is again concerned with the translation, not adaptability or something like that. Banu Mushtaq, as well as Gitanjali Shreve. Though I am not a great scholar, Hindi scholar, and nor an Urdu scholar, I can clearly understand while I was going through both the books that the translation, the titles were highly misleading, highly misleading. That also gives me, brings me back to one of the famous titles which all of you know. Chronicle of a Death Foretold, Chronica de una Muerte Anunciada, but there is a big issue in the title. The real title, if you translate it in English, is Chronicle of a Death Announced. But Gregory Rabassa, the brilliant translator who made Garcia Marquez as well as the entire Latin America open to the world, he translated it as Chronicle of a Death Foretold. Don't you think there are crucial, remarkable differences between announcing and foretelling? Of course there are. But the English title worked like a naughty fruitcake. Of course, it is written by Marquez. And several questions which Professor Trivedi rose toward the end of his lecture. I am a common layman, not even a common layman to address this. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, we had a fantastic lecture, a fantastic homage to Isaac Secura, a person whom I never could meet in my life, but I have heard a lot of stories about him, a lot of anecdotes about him. This lecture and the ideas which came out of this lecture will remain in our mind, will lurk in our mind, which make us disturb the moment when we step onto these kinds of platforms like adaptation, translation, question of originality, and what can be done. Definitely, I do believe that adaptations and translations will survive, but with problems. And those problems never can be curtailed by the intensified, sophisticated mechanisms like digital technology or even artificial intelligence. And one day we will cross the border of this artificial intelligence also by giving certain positive valences to artificial intelligence. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, sir.
Professor Kemraj to recitate, please. A very good afternoon to one and all present here. May I now invite Professor Roshan Sharma, the convener, to please come on the stage and felicitate our speaker, ISL speaker of the day, Sir Harish Trivedi ji. नहीं सर नहीं वो फिर वो प्रोफेसर खेमराज हमको डांट देंगे आप सर संभाल कर Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much, sir.
Beta, why are you so lackadaisical? You should be smart enough. Yeah, please. Now we will have that session. Yes, may I request our volunteers, Swastik and Vipasha, you come backstage. Yes, ma'am. Would you, ma'am? आप आ जाइए प्लीज आप आ जाइए इसको नहीं देंगे Concentration कौन से हुए? हैं? Concentration. Thanks, ma'am.
We come to the last session of the day, and this is the session that we've all been looking forward to, the ISM award session. And I must tell you that all our young scholars, all our younger scholars, as I said, we are all young, but there are some who are younger. So those below 40, they can try for the ISM award. And every year we get about 60 or 70 abstracts, competing for this particular award. But I must tell you what happened this time. This time, the total abstracts that we got were about 250, and we put them all in the AI generation test, and 165 turned out to be written with the help of AI. So yes, that's what happened. So I had to request everyone, please look over your abstract once again and make sure that the AI content is brought down to the permissible level. I don't know if that was responsible for the response later on, but initially about 60 or 70 abstracts were competing for the ISM award. But after this was pointed out, we got just a few papers coming in, full papers coming in, whereas normally we get about 40, 50. This time we got less than 20. Anyway, the papers that we got were all very good ones. They were long-listed and then short-listed, and we shortlist them. We pick out 3, which are presented now. And well, after the presentation, there's going to be and there's only one prize. So only one prize. Let's see. Let's hope that the best one will win. May I ask Debarati Bandyopadhyay to chair the session? Debarati, where are you? Yeah, please, Debarati. Professor Debarati is from Shanti Niketan, and she is the vice president of Melow. She'll be chairing the session and she'll be keeping time. Altogether, you get an hour and a half. So there are 3 speakers. Debarati, see how you want to divide the time. Normally, we give them 15 minutes of reading. Yeah, 20, including discussion. And discussion after each speaker works well. And the participants, the speakers are Gunjan Arora. Yes, Gunjan Arora. Oh, that's Gunjan. Is it the first time we are meeting? Yeah, so Gunjan Arora, she is a PhD scholar from LPU Jalandhar. Come, Gunjan. Snigdha Bhatt. Snigdha Bhatt is an assistant professor from St. Bede's College, Shimla. And we have Srishti Sharma, who is a PhD scholar from Indraprasth University, Delhi. Right. So we have these 3 speakers and we have Debarati chairing it. Over to you, Debarati. Thank you. With the time? You can do it. Yeah, you can do it. So we'll finish the session in an hour and a half. All the best.
You have to click here. Next.
Check, check. Hello, check. Listen, and I shall tell you that there's one man endowed with the qualities you have described, says Narad to Valmiki. His name is Ram. He has a well-proportioned body, a pure heart, an unperturbed mind, and a pleasing appearance. And I must say, nothing screams accuracy like this picture over here. Now, put your hands together for his consort and India's maternal icon, Sita. In her sultry pink plunging blouse, exposing her voluptuous breasts, swaying her hips to Central American jazz blues. Mother Sita. Let's be honest, isn't she quite a babe? Do you know how she addresses her husband? Daddy. How does it matter if the word is historically associated with prostitution? How does it matter if it refers to a pimp in old blues music? How does it matter if this is what hookers call their old male customer? How does it matter, they say? Oh, please excuse this couple. The ideals of the Indian nation have a very high libido. But can you imagine what happens when this passion engulfs Ram? He perches cross-legged on his wife, also his human footstool, and savors his teen tranquility. His other romantic gestures include kicking her, pouncing on a pregnant belly, stomping on her head while she lies sprawled on the floor because Maryada Purushottam after all. Ram is exiled in honor of Kikei's booms that she earned by saving Dashrath's life, while donning this, a blatantly sexual nurse outfit, plunging bralette, unzipped bodies, red stiletto, more like a pornographic naughty nurse trope, the media perpetuation of which has been found to normalize workplace sexual abuse for professional nurses. Still doesn't matter. While Ram is departing for the forest, she warns him with an outpouring of motherly concern and affection that, son, don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. While they are in the forest, Sita is abducted by Ravan, who is a devoted fan of Shiv. But she threatens him with her divine poise and absolute dignity. Once Ram comes here, your ass is grass. He got so scared he never had sex with her. Sita is located in Lanka by Hanuman, a Vanar, the head of a rhesus macaque monkey, grafted onto a human male figure flaunting his genitalia. For those who haven't seen before, this is what a Vanar looks like. Ram kills Ravan. They all fly back on Pushpak Viman. But you know how passionate this ideal couple is, right? They begin to celebrate midair itself. Who does that? You understand what celebrating midair means, right? Ram on top, Sita under him, legs suspended off the edge. Why can't they have a membership in the infamous Mile High Club? Composed of those who have had sex in an airplane. But how does it matter? Ram eventually exiles Sita out of peer pressure because somewhere a random washerman is beating up his wife who's a run beyond conference decorum. You know why? Because it does matter. Critics hail this as transcultural. I, however, dare call it a travesty. A very good evening, everyone. I'm Gunjan Arora, a PhD scholar at LPU Punjab, and I'm here to lift the veil of the animated intentions, religious appropriation, and the travesty of adaptation in Sita Sings the Blues, an animation that openly proclaims its source to be the Ramayana of Valmiki, directed by Jewish-American cartoonist Nina Bailey. Ever since the release of this movie in 2008, it has remained surrounded by a polarized contention. One end, devout Hindu stakeholders accusing Paley of distortion of Valmiki's original narrative that has led to the vilification of Hindu community globally. They cite their outsider status as a white American woman who's completely unversed with the socio-cultural fabric of India. And yes, has departed from Valmiki's original text. At the other end, US commentators and critical scholarship rushing to her defense, framing this as interpretive freedom, as a sacred right to free speech, legitimizing the film as a post-national, post-identitarian feminist idea of some sort. Then Paley enters the picture herself and simply brands all her critics as deluded, angry fundamentalists who have no sense of humor. That's it. Thus far, the scholarship deems this movie non-appropriative. Why? They cite a supposed absence of appropriative intent and commercial misuse. What about her neo-colonialist leanings? Not enough, they say, because Paley positions herself as an activist, creating collaborative spaces despite her American privileges. Now, if this is the ground the film chooses to stand on, let's confront it there, establishing both appropriation and the intent to appropriate. 17 years have gone by. The question still remains the same: where to draw the line between artistic freedom and appropriation? Conrad Brunk and James Young tell us where. They clearly outline what in fact constitutes religious appropriation, and Sita Sings the Blues has been found guilty in full. The first defining trait, conflation of elements from mutually incompatible religions. In this case, these are Hinduism and Christianity. Anthony E. Clark, the professor of history at Whitworth University, elucidates this incompatibility between the two religious thoughts in his essay, All Is Not One. This conflation can be witnessed in the biblically elusive tagline for the film, The Greatest Breakup Story Ever Told, and how Ramayana has been derided as, probably based on as real an event the Bible is based on, in an open mockery of his historical veracity. A Hindu saint misbranded as Mr. Parson, Ram depicted with a halo and angel wings, and Ravan with devil horns. Brunk and Young make themselves fairly clear. Whenever any culture that endured colonial disintegration like ours is appropriated without consent, without context, it amounts to second erasure. And Linda Hutchin affirms that it indeed can be an adapter's intention to consume and erase the memory of the adapted text. This legacy of Western dominance is evident in British-style poster and calendar art. See those mechanical limbs of Sita in the second picture? They echo Euro-American industrial modernism that valorizes Western advancement over non-Western stagnation. Ravan depicted as a Western academic and Sita Sari reduced to a Western bikini. Before I proceed, we must draw a fundamental distinction between insiders and outsiders. Dr. Rajiv Malhotra clarifies that insiders are those in alignment with the Vedic worldview in Indian context, and outsiders are those imbibing any of the following traits. They're dismissive of the Vedas. They view ancient Sanskrit texts through the lens of social oppression and political domination. They separate deliberately secular and sacred methodologies of interpretation. They sideline India's oral tradition as dynamic part of Indian history and thought, and view Ramayana in particular as socially abusive. which is what forms the very premise of Paley's movie, painting Ram as foolish and exploitative. We all must note here that this division transcends ethnic and geographical boundaries, and in this scenario, seals Paley's position as an outsider. Now, the following arguments apply. It constitutes an act of appropriation when outsiders monetize misrepresentation of indigenous cultures. Nina Paley inadvertently admits in one of her interviews to having earned more through film's pre-release than she would have by a conventional distribution system, amounting to 55,000 US dollars. Furthermore, these misrepresentations and appropriation persist against the will of the indigenous community. This film spread like wildfire, despite Hindu appeals to ban screenings and online circulation, but alas, to no avail. The film, in fact, went on to win numerous awards and nominations, also earning unanimous praise from the mainstream critics, which actually corroborates Brunk and Young's observation that media power lies with the appropriators, and indigenous community is silenced eventually. What is appalling to note here is that positive reviews for the film also poured in overwhelming numbers from the members of the Hindu community itself, which is consistent with Brunk and Young's claim that appropriation causes distortion to become an accepted narrative. It has. Now, interestingly, Brunk and Young exempt from the label of appropriation a mere adoption of the religious beliefs of other cultures unless presented as authentic representations of that culture. Nina Paley could have still evaded the label of appropriation, but she weakened her standing by crediting her film as based on the Valmiki Ramayana and reaffirming very emphatically in one of her interviews, and I quote, "This is all there in the Valmiki text, I'm not making it up." Well, she was. Let us now address the fidelity question. Linda Hutchin views an adaptation as a repetition without replication of its source, which underscores the fidelity that is inherent in the very act of repetition. But what does fidelity mean? James Herald says it's the thematic preservation of the source. What's theme? Core message of the story. What's core of Ramayana? Triumph of good over evil. What's the theme of Paley's movie? In her own words, it's a personal story. Strikingly, Linda Hutchin also notes that themes are in fact the easiest story elements adaptable across media. Fidelity is not difficult to achieve unless betrayal is the goal. There are certain basic industry conventions in the field of adaptation, cinematic adaptation in particular. Whenever you use the phrase based on, it expresses maximal fidelity to the source. On the other hand, the phrase inspired by sanctions more leeway with the facts. You could take more creative liberty and license, right? Now, an award-winning animator, Nina Paley, likely very well versed with these basic industry conventions, chose to opt for based on. Explain why that is. So it's time for the decisive blow. We establish her intent to appropriate. Nina Paley's biggest recourse to all these implications is her reliance on Ashya Satta's translation of the Valmiki Ramayana. Noted? Let us now present the counter quotations from the referred source itself. Vis-a-vis 3 plot point depictions, considering the time constraints, but these are major ones. Ram's mistrust on Sita despite her Agni Pariksha, Ram's suspicion over his son's paternity, and Sita's denial of rescue, lacking faith in Hanuman. Ram says, "I know Sita loves me dearly. Sita is protected by the power of her own chastity. Ravan could not have possibly touched her. She's as integral to me as the rays are to the sun." He says, "I knew in my heart that the virtuous woman was innocent, and I also know that these twin boys are my sons." Sita says to Hanuman, I know you're capable of doing all this single-handed, but you have to create the conditions for Ram to display his prowess. All it would have taken was one glance at the text. Now, who you cast in your adaptation also reflect your interpretive agenda. Nina Bailey cast non-experts in Ramayana as her narrators who are consistently making grave errors and discuss the story with irreverence. They also mock the validity of India's oral history, which is yet another identifier of the outsiders, as previously mentioned, and seals the position of Bailey's narrators as outsiders, notwithstanding their Indian ethnicity. They are Indians. So Nina Bailey chose outsiders over Ramayana to narrate Ramayana. Nina Bailey, at the very least, admits that her Sita and Goddess Lakshmi are styled after Betty Boop, the popular American cartoon character. But who is it exactly? I'll tell you. The first and foremost sex symbol of America, who's based on and whose trademark was that she wore fewer clothes than Jean Harlow, who's yet another sex symbol of the 1930s. The person who designed the character of Betty Boop, Myron Grimnatwick, describes her explicitly as a suggestion you could spell in 3 letters. Easy guess? S-E-X. It's quite ironical that Nina Bailey sexually objectifies our revered female idols and positions herself as a modern feminist. Besides, Nina Bailey acknowledges that she was aware of Ramayana's religious sanctity for Hindus and did anticipate that they might assert their cultural propriety subsequently, yet chose to proceed with the film anyway and how. Linda Hutchins states that an adapter's intent is traceable in their extra textual statements of intent, interviews, for example, and in order to retrieve the same, one must juxtapose an adapter's declaration against the adaptation itself, for the two may not align. And the road to Nina Bailey's intentions is fraught with self-contradictions. Let's count, shall we? Based on or were inspired by, not making anything up, it's Valmiki Ramayana, reaffirms Valmiki as her emotional redeemer. She says elsewhere that she was unsure of which version of Ramayana to take, so the film is not based on any single version. Goes on to deny Sita's passive depiction in the text, but which text if there isn't just one? She even goes to the extent of saying that it is not even a telling of Ramayana, but retracts on the statements in yet another interview, appealing to the humorous nature of a retelling of the Ramayana, and that offense wasn't intentional. William Irwin says, intention cannot be formed retrospectively. But yes, an artist may intend to deceive in retrospect. And Mark Twain's right. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. But what constitutes intention exactly? Irwin explains, it's a will to produce an effect that you know or believe to be subsequently understood by the audience or interpreter. Not one marker of Bailey's sincere engagement with Ramayana tradition, not one. Moreover, she says that she exaggerated characters' proportions to humorously emphasize their genders. Fair enough. Please explain. Why are her autobiographical segments spare this humorous treatment? Why confine her humor to Ramayana only? Before I conclude, allow me to briefly draw your attention towards uneven critical responses directed at cultures. Betty Boop's Bamboo Isle, a film that appropriated Samoan culture, led to the creation of Hays Code that banned not just suggestive, but any interracial content whatsoever. A language all my own. Not an appropriation, an authentic representation of Japanese culture, but the critical scholarship rushed to its defense, unveiling the imperialist undertones, perceiving Japanese people as too compliant a consumer of the Western entertainment. Sita sings the blues, of course, exploited Black women's blues as racial capital, called out rightly so, but commodification of Hindu religious sensibilities is justified because goddess Lakshmi in a bikini is transcultural.
It's time.
Last. As the final word on this subject, allow me to call upon Lord Krishna. Adharmam dharmamiti ya mannate tam savrita, sarvarthana vipritansh buddhi sa parth tamsi. The intellect that darkened by ignorance considers unrighteousness to be righteousness and perceives everything in a perverse way. That intellect, O Parth, is deluded. And if this perversion is innovation, I stand by my tradition. Thank you so much.
Yes, we will take the questions later at one go or now. Okay. One go at one go. Please remember the questions, okay? So, Bhushan,
Shall I step down?
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sing her. Yes. Sing her, introduce yourself first and then yes.
Good evening.
Which one?
Very good. Hello. Good evening, everyone. I, Smita Bhatt, will be presenting my paper on intersemiotic journeys, visual and thematic transformation. Thematic transformations from Amrita Preetam's Pinjar to Dr. Chandra Prakash Dwivedi's cinematic interpretation. Now, before I start with my paper, I have done, or all my fellow presenters have done one thing. They have converted the papers written by the writers within us to a PPT that is a cinematic representation of what we want to speak in our papers, the research that we've done. So now, if I decode the title itself, Intersemiotic Journeys, I would like to take you to Julia Kristeva. She talked about two things, that is intersemi, in which she talked about semiotic and semiology. Semiotic means study of signs and symbols, which we'll be dealing with in the text. And semiology means study of signs again, but as a part of social life in the 21st century in Dwivedi's interpretation. As Professor Roshan Lal Sir said, stories move, and I would like to add on, so do people move from readers to becoming spectators of the movie, changing their interpretation along the cinematography of the person making the movie. We'll be dealing with four major points within the presentation: understanding intersemiotic translation and its application to literary cinematic adaptations in cultural context, exploring partition literature and the cultural significance of Preetham's novel in Indian cinema, examining how Puro's journey translates from literary to visual narrative, and analyzing visual metaphors, sound design, and directorial choices. So, intersemiotic translation, we have to first understand the science of intersemiotic translations before Simba. If we talk about theory, as I told, it is about changing the meaning into different mediums by means of textual signifiers, visual, sound, or the other mediums that we can talk about. Versus literary semiotics, that is, textual narratives rely on the metaphorical languages, which we change into cinematic semiotics, that is, understanding what the text means in terms of cinematography, by the sound designs, and create different effective associations with the audience. Obviously, this all is a part of the translation process where we rearrange the textual layers. Here we even talk about the echo theory, which is nothing but how a person changes from observation and then imitates the same thing. Historical context, partition literature, and cinema. Now, if we talk about Preetham's literary foundation, that is in Pinjar, published in 1950, she initially started with the idea of representing partition, and then it went on to talking about feminine identity during the political transition, which has not been talked about. Trauma in other literature, sorry, trauma and displacement, obviously the trauma that was there in people during the time of partition, and cinematic representation. When we talk about, we'll talk about a 2003 movie made by Dwivedi, which transforms the linguistic complexity into visual and oral markers the way he understood it, and we see it now. Next, we have the character transformation. Here we'll be talking about the journey of Puro to Hamida. The protagonist, the thing is pre-abduction identity. If you can look at the picture, she's very, very happy wearing something yellow that represents sunshine, happiness. Then we see forced displacement where she was abducted by Rashid and the family. And there she wanted to go back, but because of communal violence, she could not. Then we see familial rejection. She goes back, she gets a chance to talk to her family, but she was rejected by her family and disheartened. She goes back to Rashid, where she reconstructs her identity as Hamida, because she knows that she cannot go back, okay, to the family, and she's not accepted. And that is under circumstances. We're talking about the feminine identity here. Visual narrative techniques and cinematic adaptations, we can see bar graph that I've drawn. The cinematic elements usage. Here, the film, the darker bars of the film representation and the lighter color is for the novel. The color symbolism, which we imagine is been amplified in the movie. The close-up shots obviously give us a thought, a food for thought that what the person might be going within without the interior monologues that were there in the novel. Visual metaphors, obviously lighting contrasts. Then there's costume design, landscape, silence, and sound. That means everything that a reader could imagine got a picture on screen. Color and visual metaphors, as I was talking about, the color ochre and saffron that symbolize Punjab's landscape, the dry, arid land, or also the sand that was there, the fields that were there, and also the psychological unease, because saffron is basically associated with the community, not just the land. Then we've got cinematographic strategy, obviously close-up shots, as I was talking about. Since we look at the character, we anticipate what the character might be thinking. Had we been the character, what we would be doing. This is the psychological aspect as well of the character, as well as we within the character. Thematic framework, if we talk about gender as an agency, female, as I was talking about, the feminine is obviously being talked about, the patriarchal structure. If we talk about the title itself, Pinjar is a skeleton. Here, skeleton is the skeleton of patriarchy within which we are dealing with gender and agency, how female had to have a voice within that, how she was refused by the society, yet she had to find her identity. Identity and displacement, again, personal and collective identity. We identify with Puro, each and every woman, moving from one relate with the other family. Though here we're talking in context of partition, but when women look at it, sometimes they look at it in this way as well. Cultural translation, obviously the metaphor, the visual symbols, as I told to you about the slide where we were looking at Puro, the transition of Puro from yellow to black and light brown. That means the joy that was there in yellow had just dulled down into black and brown. Trauma and memory, obviously, there is a reconstruction that we're talking about. The trauma of not being able to associate with the new identity and not being able to dissociate with the earlier identity that we talk about. Now, sound design and musical translation, as if any one of you've seen Pinjar, you would see that there are a lot of Punjabi songs that are seen. And if you see at the picture on the left, there is a song that is Mar Udari in the movie, where she is imagining about the marriage that she might have with Ramchand, and she is seeing that red color, all happiness, and in the left we see strategic use of silence, where Ramchand is thinking about something. He is thinking about the dark reality that he's been subjected to, where his sister has also been abducted. The woman he wanted to marry is no longer there, and yet he has to go on with life. Think about whom to save. Can he save both? Will the life be the same or not? Cultural context and contemporary reception, literary cinematic dialogue. So adaptation obviously causes an intertextual discourse between novelist and filmic, translation, because whatever the writer wanted to say is not necessarily translated into what the producer or the director interpreted. This obviously causes an intertextual discourse because one of the layer is unveiled, but maybe the others are still left. Then visual immediacy complements, but doesn't replace textual narrative complexity. Obviously, there have been visual effects. I said that the monologues are not there, but that does not mean that we do not remember the monologues. We remember them, but in our own language, the language of our own mind. Then we come up to contemporary audience engagement. Obviously, the film was, made in 21st century, 1950, but 2003, but the book was written in 1950. So there's a huge time gap. So obviously, some of the adaptations that were made relevant to the 21st century. We were talking about how women were finding their identity. So obviously, a little bit of changes were there. Then there was obviously an enhanced emotional connect that was there because what we were imagining was visible in the character of Puro out there. Comparative analysis, fidelity, and transformation. As I said, the adaptation was both, it was faithful and it preserved the thematic concerns. But at the very same time, there were some things that maybe some of the readers interpreted or what Amrita Pritam wanted to say and were not visible on screen because of the movie just being there for 3 hours and we have to basically read a book. We've got a lot of time to read it, a lot of time to write it. We talk about successful translations. Successful translations, obviously, the elements of successful translation that are there is the emotional intensity that we see, the psychological depth, as I was talking from the female perspective, the thematic consistency of partition was there. Cultural authenticity, obviously, symbols. There was nothing that was taken away from the landscape, from the background, or from the frames that were made. Adaptive challenges, obviously, as I told you, interior monologues were condensed, historical and political background was simplified. And the character's relationship was very archetypal in the sense that if a male had to be dominant, the male was dominant. If Puro could not go back, she could not go back. There was nothing that was reinterpreted in that way. He could not reinterpret the things. Visual innovations were there, cultural bridges were there, and interpretive expansions were there, definitely, because we were visualizing the things. Critical findings, obviously, intersemiotic translation, Divedi transforms prose into visual and sonic metaphors, as have already been talked about, gender and agency. Puro's struggle was expanded into collective women's resilience, as discussed earlier, that women were identifying with Puro not on the basis of partition, but on the basis of their personal life. So it was expanding. Trauma and displacement, symbolic landscape, costumes, and motifs, especially water. Now, water is supposed to be flowing, so it flows irrespective of the barriers that are built. And I think recently we saw Ravi flowing from Punjab towards Pakistan and other places. So water does not stop. So the emotions do not stop. So this is what I'm talking about. The trauma and displacement was basically shown through water as well, through how the water was at times shiny, at times murky, at times she was just sitting by the water to think about what had happened in her life. Okay, multimodal storytelling, obviously, because of music, silence, visuals, and other things, there were layers that were put into the movie. Historical and cultural relevance, as I told you, the novel was framed in 21st century, but with the background of partition. But it had, gender discourses as well. It was talking about the female rights at that time. That does a female need to be the same, or can she have a voice of her own or not? Limitations, loss of psychological depth. Again, the same thing as I told you. What the writer wants to write cannot be conveyed in a 2 to 3 hours movie. Character simplification. the recasting of Rashid and Ramchand weakens the nuances that had to be portrayed. Rashid was someone who abducted Puro, but in the novel, he fell in love with her. He wanted to send her back, but then got married to her and even in the movie, we could see it. But the time frame for that was reduced in the movie. So obviously, it was simplified. Melodramatic tendencies, gender and agency, obviously we are talking about that. So we're talking about one aspect in an amplified manner. So we tend to think about it as a melodrama. Historical condensation, socio-political aspects were not highlighted that much that could have been in the movie. And risk of aestheticization, that is, the visuals that were there, they reduced the authenticity of partition and suffering, because the close-up shots were just of the protagonist. The suffering that was happening on the background was not highlighted that much, if we can see in the movie. In conclusion, the cinematic adaptation of Pinjar illustrates how intersemiotic translation creates dialogues between semiotic systems, transforming literary discourse into visual poetry. The transformation demonstrates that successful adaptation involves not mere transportation, but sophisticated reconceptualization that honors resource material, which embraces the unique affordance of cinematic medium. Now, before I end my presentation, there is something that we as researchers do. We read a text, then we see the movie, then we associate with the characters, and so did the persona of Puro somehow, seeped into me. Now, this is like a thread. From Puro to Hamida was a thread of women identity, of female identity, similar to the attire that I'm wearing, the sari that is woven by threads. The colors that are used in this are from bright yellow, happiness, to black and brown, the dull colors. So everything that a female is made up of is what my attire is made up of. That is also how Amrita Preetam's picture seamlessly merged into Urmila Matondkar or of Dwivedi's picture or Puro of your Amrita Preetam. So with this, the last slide is a tribute to Amrita Preetam herself.
Thank you very much. Now, may I ask the third speaker, especially introduce yourself first and then carry on.
Uh,
Can remove the other side.
no, I need both of them. I'm sorry. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Srishti Sharma, and just 20 days ago, I just finished my Viva, so I'm kind of an independent scholar. And the topic of my presentation today is Beyond the Books, Ethics, Politics, and Visual Power in the adaptation of Game of Thrones. I'm sorry, I'm tiny and the mic needs to be adjusted. So Game of Thrones wasn't just a TV series, it was a cultural event. It broke viewership records, sparked global debates, and even turned coffee cups into headlines. But beneath the spectacle of a thorny academic question lies, and that question is, what does it mean to adapt an unfinished story? We talk about adaptations of a finished book, but this one was like unfinished. So my paper Beyond the Books looks at the ethics, politics, and visual power at stake when HBO outpaced R.R. Martin. The problem begins when the show catches up with the books, and Martin's novels are layered, ambiguous, and politically messy, as we all know. But the television has deadlines, it has audiences and dragons to show.
So from season 6 to 8, we see the shift, slow burn politics replaced by spectacular battles and sudden resolution. My approach is to look closely at the character arcs. While drawing on adaptation theory, narrative ethics, and feminist narratology, the central concern is what happens to politics and justice when adaptation outruns its source. The adaptation of George R.R. Martin's novels into HBO's GOT is one of the most significant moments in contemporary media, not just because of its global popularity, but because of its ethical, political, and aesthetic dilemmas it raises. What makes this case especially unique is that the television series eventually outpaced the unfinished literary source. Without Martin's completed novels to guide them, the showrunners had to create their own ending, and this transformed the series into a testing ground for urgent debates about adaptation ethics, narrative closure, and the responsibilities of the storytellers when no authoritative blueprint existed. When you talk about fidelity, I feel that I might have learned a few from Hayesha today, so I've added that into my conclusion, but I'll complete this section nevertheless. So in adaptation studies, one of the most persistent questions is whether an adaptation should remain faithful. Now, the whole concept of faithful, according to my recent education, has changed. But nevertheless, let me just complete this in a summarized manner. So Linda Hutchin reminds us that adaptation is repetition without replication. Each telling inevitably alters the original, shaped by new mediums, audiences, and creative contexts. For Hutchin, adaptation is both a product and a process. This is because it is a finished work that we see on screen, but also an interpretive journey that shapes it. So a lot of things are influencing this adaptation. The process is never neutral. By industrial pressures, audience expectations, the cultural movement in which it is being produced, along with the many subjectivities that shape it. Now, Stan takes fidelity further when he draws from Bakhtin. He says that the adaptation is really transformational intertextual dialogism. Basically, a work enters into a dialogue with other texts, genres, and traditions. And in GOT, that medieval fantasy colliding with HBO's prestige TV creates both a political intrigue and a blockbuster spectacle. Stan also warns against the moral fidelity. This is the idea that any deviation from the source is a betrayal. And that's exactly what we saw when the backlash to Daenerys arc existed in the media. The problem wasn't just that the show diverged from Martin, it is that those changes replaced how slow political complexity with sudden spectacle. The changes in the adaptation reveal how Game of Thrones was never a simple act of translation from page to screen. It was an act of interpretation, at times a contest with Martin's vision, and at times transformation tipped decisively towards the latter, setting the stage for a deeper question. When the original author's roadmap disappears, who becomes the true author of the story? Now, Game of Thrones entered unusual territory for an adaptation because the source material was unfinished, as I said. So, yet authorship in television is always diffuse. Who really speaks the work? The showrunners, directors, cinematographers, editors. Game of Thrones was never a single voice, but a collaborative authorship, according to me, one that was shaped by industry and commerce. Foucault's concept of the author function helps here. Authorship is not simply writing, but organizing meaning. So Benioff and Bayes assumed that role for the showrunners, turning the adaptation into a hybrid, post-translation, part original creation. But Rolla Barthes reminds us that author's intent doesn't fix any meaning. Interpretation arises when between the text and the audience. The later seasons provided this and proved this vividly. Forums, social media, and online campaigns began shaping the reception in real time. Derrida's notion of difference and iterability pushes this further. Every new iteration creates specific meanings and differs closure. After season 5, each season became its own rewriting. Arya's killing of the Night King without any literary precedent showed how the series had moved beyond adaptation into its own mythology. I've used feminist narratology as well to look at the female characters. And as Susan Lancer suggests, that the narrative authority is never neutral. It's shaped by power and gender.
She identifies three feminist narrative voices: the personal, the authorial, and the communal, each negotiating authority within the patriarchal traditions. Applied to GOT, her framework reveals how adaptation reshapes female representation in Martin's novels. Daenerys' authorial voice grants readers her access to her doubts, strategies, negotiations of power. HBO's series, however, reduces this complexity, reframing her through spectacle and the Mad Queen trope. In doing so, it shifts the narrative authority away from her voice to an external framing that constrains interpretation. Cersei Lannister undergoes a similar transformation. In the books, her authorial viewpoint reveals a woman shaped by patriarchal trauma, haunted by prophecy, and driven by both by fear and ambition. HBO amplifies her sexuality and cruelty while downplaying her strategic reason, repositioning her narrative voice from one of the calculated survivalists to that of the most straightforward villain. Sansa Stark's arc shows how HBO narrows female narrative authority as well. Uh, but on screen, her growth is recasted through trauma, especially her marriage to Ramsay. Authority is granted only after she performs the sanctioned role of a suffering woman. Her survival is framed not as self-defined growth, but as spectacle, enforcing a hetero-patriarchal logic where a woman's voice is legitimized only through victimhood. Uh, Additionally, one sees that Sansa's earlier identity, naive, romantic, tied to courtly ideals, exists within a semiotic, according to Kristeva, an affective space that the narrative progressively strips away through the moments of abjection. For example, her forced marriage to Ramsay, sexual violence, and public humiliation. These episodes push her to confront the boundaries between the self and what is socially intolerable. Yet, instead of allowing this confrontation to yield a hybrid self-articulated subjectivity, the series reinscribes her into a symbolic order of patriarchal politics. The spectacle of her suffering is consumed by the audience as a proof of her maturity, turning trauma into a narrative necessity rather than a right or a site of resistance. Stuart Hall's theory of representation complements this by framing media text as contested spaces where meaning is encoded and decoded through dominant, negotiated, or oppositional readings. What I mean is when an adaptation replaces a woman's careful political maneuvering with the scenes of specularized and spectacularized trauma, it risks aligning with the dominant cultural codes that position women primarily as victims rather than as agents of change. In contrast, R.R. Martin's novel often encode resistant readings, foregrounding women's subtle acts of political agency as central to the narrative. Together, Hutchin and Hall make it clear that the ethical stakes of adaptation extend beyond fidelity to a plot. They encompass fidelity to the politics of representation, determining whether the subversive gender politics of the source text are sustained, diluted, or erased in the translation. Adaptation is never just about moving from page to screen. When Banov and Weiss adapted The Song of Ice and Fire, they simplified Martin's morally ambiguous world, turning uncertainty into visual decisive endings. Legitimacy in the books is always unstable. The show, by contrast, codes power in dominant terms. Daenerys as the Mad Queen, Bran as the unquestioned king, or the female power often reduced to a spectacle. Walter Benjamin warns us of spectacle's danger, politics turned into aesthetic consumption. GOT shows this by burning of the King's Landing, where ethical debate is flattened into cinematic awe. The ethics of an unfinished epic. I would like to talk about how Walter Benjamin's idea of an artwork's aura refers to the unique authority and authenticity of the original. When a TV series ends a story, the book hasn't finished yet. The aura can fade, replaced by an ending shaped by industrial production rather than author's own hand. And GOT did exactly that. The adaptation made the story far more accessible worldwide, but in doing so, it took the open-ended speculative space of the novels and locked it into a definitive version. Hall's encoding-decoding theory helps explain what was lost in that move. Hall also reminds us to look at the production context here. HBO faced tight filming schedules, shorter final seasons, and the pressure to deliver blockbuster-scale moments, all of which shaped how the ending looked and what it meant. Hutchins' work on adaptation argues that the creativity matters more than strict loyalty to the source, but when the source is unfinished, creative choices come with extra responsibility. Stan's ideas about the adaptation politics place this changes in the bigger web of influences. HBO's ending didn't just adapt Martin, it pulled away from the fantasy TV tropes. Fan expectations, big screen spectacles. In moments like Burning Things Landing, the show chose shock and spectacle over messy ethics of war and vengeance. The decisive finale reveals the risk of closing ambiguity too quickly. By simplifying Martin's complex multivocal narrative, the show highlighted both the power and the pitfalls of adaptation in a convergent post-literary age. And as Hutchian reminds us, the adaptation is less about fidelity and more about layering, where new meanings are written and over the old. In the post-literary space, stories live across media, shaped by industry pressures and global fan responses. And Altman's genre theory helps us see this flexibility. GOT combines spectacle with grounded politics, reflecting postmodern intertextuality by remixing traditions and expectations. And Jenkins' idea of media convergence shows that the saga spread across platforms, novels, episodes, forums, where fans and creators together shaped the meaning. So, in order to conclude, so, what does Game of Thrones really teach us? The story today is no longer confined to a single genre, a single book, or a single medium. Post literary storytelling dissolves those boundaries. As Rick Altman reminds us, genres are flexible, and the series proved it by blending fantasy, politics, and melodrama and spectacle into a cultural phenomena. But as I recently learned, adaptation isn't about fidelity. In fact, it is a gendered word. Women are judged by it, and men are not. In adaptation studies too, fidelity demands loyalty while punishing deviation, mirroring patriarchal double standards. The paradox is this: the first adaptations happen the moment we speak. Speech itself is performative, as I quoting this, and it adapts the gaps of the text into meaning, which means sameness is impossible, which defines adaptations is excess. What gets added, whether spectacle, multiplicity, or new subjectivities. Thinking of cultural traditions, as Sir talked about Ramayana in his speech, Tulsidas Ramcharitmanas or Thai's Ramakin, each retelling is not a copy but a fully independent text. Plots are scaffolds, as I've understood. It's a treatment, the politics, the style that makes the work. So yes, GOT displaced interiority with spectacle, but on the other hand, if you compare it, The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu does the opposite. It takes Ashford's singular voice and redistributes it into a chorus: handmaids, wives, martyrs, aunts, and even men. And that expansion multiplies meaning, transforming the adaptation into a communal feminist narrative with global political resonance. In the end, adaptation definitely is not about fidelity but transformation, I believe. GOT and Handmaid's Tale together show us the spectrum, how stories can erase complexity or multiply it. And more than that, they remind us that in the age of convergence, stories are no longer authored by one writer or screen, but by the dialogue between creators, industries, and us, the audience. Thank you.
We have just had three very young and very promising scholars competing for the Isaac Securial Memorial Prize. So, I understood that they had engaged with the topics with various kinds of nuances, nuanced readings of the subject and various degrees of theoretical engagement as well. Now, the audience might ask the necessary questions to all three speakers. Yes.
Thank you. So I have a question for the first presenter, I think Gunjan. So Gunjan, let me congratulate you first. It was a wonderful presentation and eye-opener for us. I personally liked it a lot, but then I have a question. So when you presented, one thing is clear, that the modern digital culture, in the age of especially animations and cartoons, remakes, remixes, TikToks, they have all blurred the boundary between adaptation, imitation, and distortion, right? And the example you had given today was a clear-cut example of distortion. So, what is your view on this? So, my question is very clear that does the idea of, the notion of distortion in adaptation studies, it depends on the audience response or the author's intention? Because there are laws, when we talk about animations which blindly hurt the intentions of a particular community. And there are certain laws and legalities attached to it. Still, we see them. So, do you think it's intentional, or do you think we are taking it so we see that there? So, what do you have to say about it as a presenter?
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for such a pertinent question. The laws you were talking about that hurt religious sentiments, where the hurting of religious sentiments is implicated, it was previously 295A of the IPC, which has been replaced by Section 299 of Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita on July 1, 2024. Whether or not a distortion is an outcome of malicious intention, or is it purely the comprehensibility of the audience? Ma'am, as I've already mentioned, what constitutes intention is that you're willingly inserting a malicious element that you know will hurt the audience. And of course, it is reflective in your adaptation and subsequently understood by audience as such. That is why the audience that is constitutive of devout Hindu stakeholders alleged that it was in fact distorted. So it is partly both. And the reason why it is because you can never divorce intentions from how it is to be subsequently understood. So that is my response to it. It is partly both.
Thank you. I have a quick suggestion for Shrishti and a question for Gunjan. Shrishti, thank you. I'm a big fantasy fan, and so I've seen all of the Game of Thrones and I've read all of the books as well. So I think one thing that was kind of missing, or you might want to think about, is the issue of medium specificity, Because I think part of what happened, the mess that they made in the last few seasons, had to do with the medium. Because it's an OTT series and it rewards spectacle, right? That spectacle of suffering that Sansa underwent. Whereas the novel rewards interior consciousness, right? And yeah, let me just finish this. And so one thing is that, right? And secondly, compression, right? Because they had to finish it. They had to finish it within 2 seasons, which George R. R. Martin has the luxury to write 5 more books, but they didn't have that, right? So it's actually the medium specificity that is causing the mess. If you could respond to that, but before that, let me just ask one quick question to Gitanjali as well. Sorry, what's your name? Gunjan. Yes, so sorry. Gunjan, I can see that there was a lot of outrage in your talk, and I understand that religious sentiments potentially being hurt. But you seem to be responding, and I haven't seen this text. Sita feels the glue. I haven't seen it. So you seem to be responding to its irreverence as well as its sexual frankness, lasciviousness, prurience, whatever you want to call it. So my question is very simply, what are you comparing them to? What is the original text that you've read? Because there is no her text of the epics, right? That each epic is a library rather than a single text. And moreover, if you do read, any of the longer recensions, you'll see that at least the Mahabharata, maybe not so much the Ramayana, can be extremely lascivious, can be extremely sexually frank, and can be extremely irreverent as well. So if you could respond to that.
Okay, thank you first of all for the question. you really have to have, like, you really need to have an eye for this kind of detail, which is reflected in the question that you have asked. I must stick to Ramayana only because that has been my topic. So, the case of Ramayana, as you said, there is no art text of Ramayana. Dr. Shatpatwani R. Ganesh has established that there is, in fact, an art text of Ramayana, and the subsequent adaptations of Ramayana have relied on Valmiki's version of Ramayana. Who's before Valmiki, if anybody could answer that? So, that has been established as the art text of Ramayana. The case of Ramayana has been particularly peculiar and curious because it preempts any misinterpretations. And I would like to quote from Ramayana. The citation is 1 to 33 to 35, when Lord Brahma descends to the earth and commands Valmiki to compose Ramayana. He says, Rahasyam cha prakasham cha yadvitam tasya dhimatam ramasya se saumitre rakshasanam cha sarvasha dede hayashitya yadvidram prakasham yadivarah tachapya viditam sarvam viditam te bhavishyati nate valuta kavya kachi tatra bhavishyati. What are there has to be a room for interpretation for the subsequent adapters or interpreters to insert their perspectives in there. There is no room for misinterpretation in Ramayana. Lord Brahma says that whatever you write as by the means of this text that you're composing, there will be no omission. There will be no omission of the implicit thoughts of the character, and there will be no falsehood whatsoever. Please, if you could answer that, where is the room for misinterpretation?
Sense from a religious perspective, then, but from a purely textual perspective, any text is subject to depredations, revisions, and they were composed from a non-religious perspective.
Yes.
One would say that both of the epics were composed over hundreds of years,
Yes.
and they represent many hands,
Yes.
and that they have been subject to change. And I mean, your position, I understand where it's coming from, that it's a pure text, etc. But consider whether that attitude towards textuality may be more Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic than indeed Indian. I ask you to think about that.
So the depiction or the engagement with this textual discourse cannot be purely literary. That is why we have a field of decolonial studies. Why would that field emerge? If it was purely literary, and any text, any culture could be depicted and could be departed from its original essence to whatever extent possible, why would we have the field of decolonial studies? Why would these imposition of Christian templates, why would these templates be called out? I'll condense my answer.
Hi, sir. I am an equal, maybe I am maybe younger, so maybe a little less, but a big fan of fantasy fiction. So, to answer your question, yes, spectacle can amplify the risk presence. But when a spectacle replaces interiority, it risks reinforcing objectification rather than expanding subjectivity. So, Lancer and Butler help us see that agency comes from being able to author one's own voice, right? Not just from being visible. Let's take Kimetsu no Yaiba. We just saw the Tanjiro's battles, the breathing animations, water breathing, or Hinokami Kagura. All of them are forms that are not just visual access, They are embodiments of his inner world. We get to see his interiority, his subjectivity, his discipline, his grief, his love for Nezuko, and his memories of his father, right? Similarly, if you remember, I don't know if you've seen Handmaid's Tale, but if you have, if you haven't, then maybe you should go back and see it. It's a wonderful, wonderful work done. And June's face during the bombings, the camera lingers, showing us her fear, her rage, her defiance. Those are like big spectacle moments on screen, bombings happening, the center is burning, the commanders are dying. And the riots and public executions, when that are staged in Handmaid's Tale, they're grand, almost like on a cinematic scale, if you could see the focus shift back to the women watching it, whispering, resisting that silence. Here, that was altered, not only their plot, but also their feelings, their interiority with the spectacle. Which is why I said what I said. Does it answer you?
Yeah, not disagreeing at all. What I'm saying is that the medium might lend itself to that kind of spectrum.
Which is why I gave you examples from the
Right.
medium itself, The spectacle doesn't need to erase subjectivity. It forces us to experience the character's inner life against the oppressive political theater.
Agreed, and I have read Handmaid's Tale, so I think it's very much there in the source text as well, that literature feminine that she does, you see that interior space. That gets translated well in the OTT, I guess. I haven't seen it. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I would like to congratulate all of you presenters for those very insightful presentations. And my question again is to Mr. Roda. So, if I remember correctly, and I think I do because the word that you use stays with me. So, by comparing the very sexualized figures that really creates, you use the word prostitute. And tomorrow I'll be presenting the paper on voter funds. And let me just bring it to your attention that the word is usually assigned to this very transactional relationship, right? And so when you use the word, and I think it is also based on the kind of disagreement that you had with PDI, I draw from that you have a very negative connotation for the word prostitute. So how is it that we're using such negative connotations for women to judge other women, and all of these considerations are based in feminism? How is that?
Because the operative word in the adaptation is not prostitution, it's daddy, which has two other meanings attached to it also. What hookers call their old main customers, and what refers to a pimp in old blues music. There are two other meanings attached to it also. Prostitution is how the audience perceives it to be. You're right in negating the negative connotation of the word. You're absolutely right there. But it was directed at a particular audience who understood the word to be a particular way, and that is not an operative word. The operative word was daddy, and a misunderstanding of how Sita addressed Ram as daddy.
So just a little short for that. My question is very specific to your usage of the word prostitute.
Not my usage of the word. It's had been embedded and a pervasive and a recurrent usage in the movie itself. I hope this answers your question.
Hi, Varshan, you are a really good orator and it was engaging, but I have a different opinion. So before I written down my question, it's a bit long. I'd like just to say that I'm not an expert, but during my master study in comparative literature at Jadavpur, I had a course on women's Ramayana, and from that I framed some questions. And also, you said that the Valmiki Ramayana is a earth text. I think there were other little traditions and Itihasa Puranas that were present before it. I state my question. So for your presentation, I felt that there was a tendency to canonize this Ramayana with its brand of dominant narrative, where you really can't do any oppositional readings. Now, if we talk about early women's retellings or tales like Chandravati's Sita, which is really subversive, like where Sita is Ravana's daughter and where there are scenes of Bashor, which comes from a very unique Bengali cultural context where sexual talk is a natural part. They have long been accepted as cultural expressions that critique Rama and foreground Sita's suffering. Then why is a modern filmmaker's attempt to do the same dismissed as appropriation? This also becomes important when you're using the term hurting indigenous communities. If you're invoking that, because the indigenous community is not a homogeneous body, but a plurality of voices that have historically disaggregate, critique, and reshape the epic in their ways. Even the sexualized portrayals of the so I feel like Nina Bale's portrayal was a kind of, it was to show the fixation on the female body. Like there is a tradition called Nakashika tradition, which Navalita writes about. So why am I calling it as an appropriation? It can be creative freedom and license that every filmmaker can exercise.
Ma'am, you are a PhD scholar? Okay. The credible voices in the field of academia who are established theories for I don't know how many decades have laid down this criterion where you can actually you can actually call out the appropriation criteria. What constitutes religious appropriation has been established. So if you go by that, and not again, okay, even if you negate my argument that Ramayana has no or text, the objective of this paper was to establish that Nina Peli had malicious intent behind this adaptation of Ramayana. It has been proven over the course of my presentation, of course. It was the intention that was to be called out, relying on Brunk and Young, Conrad Brunk and James O. Young's criterion of religious appropriation that is laid out after years and years of research. The fact that there is a concept of religious appropriation in existence reiterates the fact that religious appropriation exists. And this Ramayana cannot be divorced from its religious implications. What did I say in the introductory segment of my presentation? This appropriation, this distortion, which you call a mere adaptation.
We want to put a halt to it. Some speakers have not got an opportunity, no? So,
Let me just finish one line.
no, enough.
If anybody has any questions or speak,
I just have a, yes. For Gunjan? Sure. Before we return to Gunjan, may I ask a question? Yes, Daniel has a question? Yes. Waiting. From the first page. So, can I? We have not had time. Gunjan, thank you for a wonderful paper. So I just want to draw your attention to something. I thought probably the debate will be broader. It's an uncanny resemblance to another situation, and I want to stand on that. So the ultimate example of Western patronizing of religious indelicacy would be Rushdie.
Separate verses are you talking about in particular?
So he's the ultimate example of the West's adoption of a writer who was religiously indelicate. So do you have an opinion on that?
I would like to reserve my opinion here because I do not want to sound cryptic and get away with a question concerning a book that I have not read. So first I'll go and read the text and then respond accordingly, perhaps another forum, of course.
The situation is because you did bring up the idea of the
Yes.
West lapping up of the writer,
Right.
because she's being insensitive.
Ma'am, just one counter question. Do you think it was justified satanic versus the adaptation?
I don't want the question. I want
Okay,
your
okay,
answer.
okay, ma'am.
I just want your.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, the point is that in the introductory segment also that I've mentioned it was that the outcome of this distortion has been vilification of Hindu community globally. And this is the reason why we even set out to write papers like this, because it does result in the vilification of a particular community. I think same has been the case, if I'm not wrong, because I've not read the text. A few years ago, if I can recall, if my memory doesn't fail me, he was stabbed for having written satanic verses. Yes, right. All right.
So I just give my observations and the three, and you are free to answer wherever you feel comfortable. All right. So to Gunjan, so first, yeah, I'm just giving to all three so they can answer. Right.
That's might ask something.
Acha, the same question. I mean, she wants to answer. The second participant wants. Yeah, yeah.
The first.
See, get to second first. I answer. Right. So you're talking about the cinematic gaps towards the end of your presentation where you were talking about the colors and all. So what were the sources of that?
Mom, initially first I saw the movie, the reviews, and I watched the movie, and then I was intrigued by the idea that who wrote it. I got to know that Amrita Pritam has written it, and I had, a different idea about Amrita Pritam, a little different about her personal life. That is what I read. Then I went and I read the novel. I read it, from an independent point of view. What I imagined, the gap that I'm talking about, in my imagination, Puro and the situation was a little different. When I talk about the movie, I saw a lot of these saffron colors, as I was talking about the saffron, the water, and every other thing, which when I read the text are not that visible in my imagination.
Very subjective.
Yes, yes.
Because you quite, elaborated, this was not there, so, all right.
And as my personal observation.
Yeah. And you were talking about character transformation of Guru to Hamida. I was just wondering, what does this word transformation means? But I'm not finished. Because Puro became Hamida under external compulsive and forcible conditions. So can we call it a transformation? And then what about the innate one? Right? And you also, while you were delivering, you said we can identify with Puro. I think this is a very loose normalization. I mean, we are not Puros anywhere. I mean, we are quite. I mean, we can't put in the at least in degrees we differ, so we cannot normalize that. And the third observation is that fidelity is compromised and creativity comes in. We have been talking about adaptations and all. So, what is your take on this? Is not directly from your paper, but of course, because it is a screen adaptation. What would what is your take on the movies that are seemingly well researched by Vivek Agnihotri, and he has made 3 movies on it, and on the different historical events that have happened. So, what do you think? Are they politicized? They are made with some purpose, or they are well researched and we can really rely on them. So, if you want to find it,
Ma'am, first of all, thank you for the question. I have been your student, so it's an honor to answer your the transformation that we were talking about, Guru to Hamida. Yes, she transformed under external factors, but internally as well, from being a lively girl who's dreaming about a life after engagement or after marriage with Ramchandra, to someone who was forced into adapting another thing, adopting another religion, and having a different lifestyle. It was a transformation that was due to external agencies, but was internalized because she went from being lively to becoming lifeless. From thinking about herself, her happiness, to thinking about the happiness of the person who she loved before, that is Ramchand, when she basically helps Laju, the sister of Ramchand, to escape that land. This is what I think. That though it was internal, but the transformation ultimately resulted into sorry, though it was external, it turned into an internal thing. Ma'am, the third one, because I've not watched the movie of Vivek Agnihotri, so I can't answer. The second one, I forgot. If you could.
That's all right.
Thank you.
Just an observation.
Sure, ma'am.
So, Srishti, just 2 little observations. One is, like, I remember Dickens saying that, he would just, draw characters on the wall and the story would, be weaved out of it. And when we're talking about adaptation, because you talked about Games of Thrones, which was didn't have an ending, but still it was adapted. So what I was wondering that whether adaptation also takes on itself and it is driven by demand and revenue and peace.
To a very large extent, in today's time, yes.
Yes, because we have OTT and I remember that day there was a couple who was saying that they would go to the evening parties by finishing the episodes. So how does creativity comes, in that?
Uh, Ma'am, it's a broader production issue. It's not just specific to adaptation. It's specific to every production. All of them always see all of that we produce is a cultural act for sure. And dominant ideologies often seep, yes. But then comes the word sensationalization. Then also comes the word spectacle. Then also comes the word that you want to sell everything that you produce, the good or the bad. But then there are productions like Alias Grace, productions like The Handmaid's Tale. They've actually collected revenues. But then there's GOT. The problem is about the awareness of actually molding the character in a way that is not sexualized or spectacularized or in a way just becomes a product. Even to sell a vest, you need a woman one.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, Srishti,
Yes.
your slide said dissolution of bound been talking about, right? So, but my question is, can there be an absolute dissolution? Because when you read adaptation theory and there's an open tree model, which just truncates out and reader becomes, he's responding. It's an open tree model. But that open tree model also has some sort of holding, it's some rooting is there. So can you just
I think only, yes, fan fiction, online debates often restore, let's say in this case, female agency, when they were questioning the alternative arcs. But I would say that, I'm sorry, can you just say it again? Yes, now, so I think when we go back to Sir's speech and a little bit of Plato, everything is an imitation game. So the core plot remains the same. It's about the adaptation of the plot, the process, what they produce out of the plot. Yes, it does come new, but it still has its own, I think, the framework. The structural integrity remains the same to some extent, I would say. There is some grounding. Does it answer? Thank you.
Right now, please consider me just as a member of the audience, and I have a question for Signa. It is in terms of your use of the expression cinematic interpretation. Now, we all know that films have a different kind of language, and if you are trying to bring in the expanse of a novel into a film of 2.5 hours, you have to do certain things. But even in spite of that, we're discussing adaptation, and could you enlighten us a little about the way you are trying to talk about the relation between adaptation and interpretation in your chosen text?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. There are two words that we're talking about. One is adaptation, the other is interpretation. So first I'll talk about interpretation, because first you need to interpret a text in order to adapt it. So according to me, I talked about the echo theory, where you first see a thing, observe a thing, and then you imitate that thing. So when I talk about the way, literature that I'm talking about, and the way Dr. Devedi that I'm talking about, he first read the novel, then he looked at the 21st century, thing that was happening out here, the demands that were there, and what he would highlight, and then he adapted according to it. He wanted to keep the authenticity of the storyline, but at the very same time, he wanted to merge with the audience, because at the end of the day, as was discussed, that we need some, revenues as well. So what we're talking about is cinematic adaptations. So first you interpret the text according to what the writer wants to say, where the depth of the author happens, according to that, and the reader interprets the text in his own way. Then he looks around and assimilates his own situation or the situation around, and for Dr. Devedi, because he wanted some revenues, or the other people that are there in cinema, they would obviously want some kind of, a revenue out of it. So they will look at the scenario around and then highlight what they interpret out of it and what is the need of the space. So that is how interpretation, adaptation in cinema happens according to me. Thank you.
you, Sita. If there are no other questions, then perhaps we will. Daniel, could you be a little brief because we are running out of time actually.
I have two questions.
The microphone.
Like this.
The microphone. Where is it?
Yeah. Very good. Yes, I know.
Questions directly.
I think only two commentaries like act of ethics my first for Gunjan. When you talk about very serious problem, attention, religion topics in animation films, I think about, I have in my memory, big discussion in Europe after two films. First, the last adaptation of Christ, last adaptation of Christ, it was 1988, I think. And before, 10 years before, we had scandal because we watched a film Brian's life. And it was big problem for Christians. Artists can attack religion leaders like Jesus Christ or not. And it is question for to you exactly. Maybe this proposition you mentioned about animations from Jewish American filmmaker.
Drawing the parallel between two scenarios.
Yeah. Maybe it is not serious, only it is like independent act of art. And maybe it is not serious problem. Maybe it is question.
If it were to be considered as an independent work of art, there would be no malicious intent behind that. There would be no over-centralization, eroticization, as Edward Said has said. It is usually the case how Eastern women are perceived by the West, and he too has called it out, and so am I. And why can't we study religions, two different religions, in their own terms? Why does one have to be imposed onto the other to understand the other? Because let's be honest, the field of adaptation is not an even playing field. We are a former colony, West is not. So the day it becomes an even playing field and we're respectful towards each and every culture, each and every religion, I think that is the time we could take this discussion forward. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. And second question is into Srishti Sharma. When you talk about Game of Thrones, I think about one paragraph of your article, your paper, when you mention about forms, about people, audience, who can make choose what will be next chapter, what will be in next film, next part. And I think maybe I'm not right. You are afraid, woman. You're afraid it is maybe dangerous for clear topics. Maybe it is dangerous for original source, but it is commentary and it is question. I think about one very popular in Europe film, Black Mirror. Maybe you know Black Mirror. It is series.
I think maybe 30 parts. And one part is Bandersnatch. It is interactive chapter, this series. When if you are very calm audience, you can see film 30 minutes. Yeah. But if you engage to film, you spend maybe 90 minutes because you have every 5 minutes you can change a lot.
I think, firstly, I want to say today the Russians are more like breaking of the fourth wall, the Brechtian theory comes to mind. Absolutely, fan fiction and online debates often restore, let's say, in this instance, female agency or imagine alternative arcs. This is an example of oppositional decoding, as Paul suggests. Audiences refusing the dominant framing and reclaiming interpretive authority. But that resistance, however, underscores how contested these representations remain. And many times their understanding and their idea about how they should be represented is actually considered. And to add a little bit to Man's question and your question, I would say the old I'm here a little confused. I wanted to talk to her later about it. The old may not be a measuring rod, and the new is not a part of the old, but rather I feel like an amoeba, that's split into two. Plato's cave frames imitation as a shadow play, derivative of never original, but the old fidelity model and the copy can only be judged against the real thing is not exactly applicable today. So there are two metaphors. The gravitational pull metaphor captures continuity. The old text still matters to some extent. The adaptations circulate, resist it, draw energy from. And the amoeba metaphor that I've thought of captures transformation. The slit produces new, the living text each carries some DNA of the source, but evolves into an independent organism. But today, that independent organism is a collective subjectivity of the viewers, of the directors, the screenwriters, the script writers, the cinematographers, the editors, as well as the production house.
Okay.
Thank you for your question.
Okay, I think the three speakers had ample opportunity to answer all your questions so far. So the question answer session is over for the present, and you can have your discussions outside over tea, over a cup of tea, or possibly in a few minutes. But in the meantime, the very important thing, the decision, and we are awaiting the decision, right? So could the judge please come up to the stage? May I please request one of the judges to come up stage and say. Okay, yeah. Okay. So I think we enjoyed this session. Volley of questions proved that, isn't it? So can we have a huge round of applause for all the three shortlisted presenters? So it was pleasure and wonderful listening to all the three presentations. Gunjan, of course, I need not say more than what you have got from the audience. But yes, one thing I have just been rightly pointed out, it is that please, it's not movie adaptation. In an academia, it is film adaptation. So don't just interchange the words, please. So Snigdha, you talked about visual and thematic transformation from Amrita Pritam's Pinjar to Dwivedi's cinematic interpretation. So we really enjoyed your paper and your research rigor with which you had made comparisons of both the genres and of course Srishti. Beyond the books, ethics, politics and visual power in the adaptation of Game of Thrones. It was again a delight, well researched, and you had actually brought in a lot more, critics on your slides. And thank you once again. And of course, we really had a tough time. And I should be saying this
that Roshan is also an ISM winner, and I too in 2014. So, Roshan, which was your year? Which he's so tired he might not remember. 2008. Seven. And okay. So it is a coveted thing. And please, you consider yourself winners, and we really had tough time to decide on to which should be who should be selected, right? So Srishti, you are the winner, right? So you have won 2025 ISM Award, well-written paper. And Gunjan, you will also receive certificate of commendation. So congratulations to both. And Snigdha, all the best for your next time, right? Thank you so much. Thank you, Devruti.
Any announcements to make?
May I now request Professor T.N. Dhar, sir, to come upon the stage and felicitate Professor Devarati Bandhopadhyay, ma'am, Melow Vice President and Chair for this session.
Sessions university में
Sure.
कल ही उनको दिया हुआ है मैं
Okay, right now, ma'am?
afterwards.
Okay, afterwards.
Oh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. All the sessions for tomorrow will take place at the main campus of the university, which is just down the road. Thank you so much. And the link has been shared. Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, and the award will be given on the last day, valedictory session.